Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. I'm Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and this is a special episode of the podcast. Under normal circumstances, this time of year would have been when the American Educational Research Association held its annual meeting. That meeting was canceled, but I am happy to bring at least one of the research symposia that would have been at AERA. In this episode, we're going to hear from 4 studies of flipped instruction. Now, flipped instruction is something that I've been involved in studying with my colleague Zandra Araujo here at the University of Missouri. And flipped instruction just involves some form of assigning homework to students that maybe involves watching a video or doing something online, kind of possibly getting some content delivery at home. And then when you come to class, you can build on that. You can maybe do some activities. It can take a lot of different forms, but it's some sort of use of the instructional videos, incorporating that into the instruction. And we have some folks who've been studying flipped instruction from a few different angles and from different contexts, and we're going to get to hear from them. So in this podcast version of Symposia, what we're going to do is hear from 4 separate studies, and then we're going to have a chance to talk across those studies and just share some of our ideas about flipped instruction. So we're going to start with Ruby Ellis and JP Han, who are from the University of Missouri here, and they have a study about patterns in empirical studies of flipped mathematics instruction. That is a literature review study from Ruby and JP. Then we will have Wenmin Zhao and Jessica Kamuru, also from the University of Missouri, and they have a study entitled Patterns in Algebra 1 Classes Implementing Flipped Instruction, an observational study. Next, we will turn over to Jeremy Strayer from Middle Tennessee State University, who has a study entitled Characterizations of Flipped Instruction, Mathematics Teaching Practices and Teachers' Enactment Zones. And then our final study will be from Darryl Yong from Harvey Mudd College, and that is entitled The Primary Affordance of Flipped Instruction Might Be More Opportunities for Active In-Class Engagement. So after we hear from those studies, we will have an opportunity to have a discussant, which is Jeff Choppin from the University of Rochester. So he'll have a brief response for us to share some thoughts, and he'll get us started with some questions across the 4 studies. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead to our first study from Ruby Ellis and JP Han, and that is from our larger project funded by the National Science Foundation, as is the second study also, that is principally investigated by Zandra Araujo. But Ruby and JP, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having us. The flipped math study research team at Mizzou is working on a qualitative meta-analysis of the literature on flipped mathematics instruction. The purpose of this literature review falls into 2. First, we want to understand the research method previously used to study flipped instruction and the context in which those research methods were used. Second, we wanted to provide future researchers with understanding of the impact of a flipped instruction on the teaching and learning of mathematics. For this literature review, we initially searched peer-reviewed empirical publications on ERIC database, but we realized that some of the math ed journals and computer journals were not listed on the ERIC database, so we expanded our literature search to individual journals in mathematics education and computer education. And using the term flip, FLIP, and FLIPP, we searched title, abstracts, and keywords and found the total of 1,148 publications. We read through the abstracts of these publications to check whether each article is empirical, uses flipped instruction, and focuses on mathematical content. After the initial screening, we identified 117 publications, and we recorded each article's definition of a flipped instruction, research questions, overall methodology, details of a methodology and data sources, participants' information, mathematical content of focus, length of study, measure the outcomes, details of the flipped and comparison classrooms, and their findings. Dr. Ruby Ellis will share the preliminary findings of this ongoing analysis with you.
All right, thank you, JP. So far we've coded 97 of the 117 articles that we have included in our study. And we found that 49% of those studies used quantitative research methods, 12% used a qualitative research method, and 39% used both qualitative and quantitative methods, so mixed methods research. So study participants included elementary, secondary, and post-secondary students within the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia, with the majority of the studies being conducted in post-secondary institutions within the United States. So 71 out of the 97 studies happened within post-secondary institutions, and 52 of those were in the United States, and only 3 were conducted in an elementary setting. So far, findings from those studies include numerous positive findings in favor of flipped instruction in mathematics classrooms. Of the 97 studies, 57 of those actually measured mathematics achievement by comparing flipped instruction to non-flipped instruction. Of those 57, 53 reported at least one statistically significant result in favor of flipped instruction. 15 reported at least one result that did not show a statistically significant difference in student achievement, and only 3 so far have reported statistically significant results that were not in favor of flipped instruction. Some additional things that we also found were numerous positive impacts of the flipped instruction on mathematics achievement, their anxiety level of students, their class attendance, motivation, and their study habits. So coding of these studies is ongoing, and we are also continuing to analyze these studies for the other items that JP mentioned. One other thing, the content area that was a main focus in these studies, a lot of them were focused on statistics. So 21% of the studies focused on statistics, 15% with college level calculus, and 11% were focused on college algebra, and only about 12% looked at pre-algebra and algebra at the secondary level.
My name is Jessica Kamuru, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Missouri-Columbia. I'm going to start off talking to you about the patterns in Algebra 1 classes implementing flipped instruction and observational study. So in this analysis, we examined the variability that happens within the instruction of flipped Algebra 1 classrooms. So we were looking at what happens during the in-class time. We used our flipped framework to examine the in-class time in terms of how time was used in different lesson formats, the type of student activities, and student involvement. As a research team, using our protocol, we observed 13 teachers 3 times and completed an aggregated lesson profile for each teacher that captured a typical class experience for the students in that class. Overall, we found 2 prominent teacher profiles, and I'll discuss the first one now. The most dominant profile fit the description of what we called Type 1. Type 1 teachers were flipped teachers who generally assigned student videos to be watched before the following class. So usually they were assigned as homework the class session before. Class time was used mostly for working independently on procedural problems. The teacher may have reviewed part of the video that was assigned, and perhaps classroom announcements were made that were not related to content, and we actually called that like classroom business. During this type of instruction, student engagement typically started high at the beginning of class, but then tended to fade and decrease as the class session continued. And now Wenmin will talk about the next type.
Thank you, Jessica. So Jessica just talked about the first type of flipped instruction. In our analysis, we also found that some flipped instruction included more classroom interactions. For example, one of our flipped teachers intervalled her whole class discourse with some group activities and some independent work time. Compared with the first type, this type of lessons had more than 1 lesson videos and then 1 lesson full site. That is what students are supposed to learn on that day. And then they had more teacher lecture time. Students interacted with their peers more frequently. However, we also noticed more off-task behaviors in this type of classroom. Our findings show different enactments of flipped instruction in the U.S. Algebra 1 classrooms. There are more than 2 types of flipped instruction, and here we just briefly mentioned the two most common types. We hope that other researchers in the future can continue to document flipped classroom profiles to understand the diversity of flipped instruction in other contexts, so that we can draw meaningful conclusions about how different forms of flipped instruction are related to students' learning.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks to Sam for pulling this session together, especially under these circumstances, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to share my work and thoughts at this session. My work with the flipped classroom began around 2002, initially as a practitioner interested in teaching with technology, then as a researcher investigating the impact of the flipped classroom design on classroom learning environments. In that work, I found that students in flipped classrooms prefer learning in environments that explicitly connect the out-of-class activities, which they usually experience asynchronously, with the synchronous in-class learning tasks that they complete. I used these results to theorize different types of flipped classrooms that might produce these connected environments for students. Specifically, I wanted to explore how the flipped classroom might be leveraged to enact evidence-based teaching practices, for example, those included in NCTM's Principles to Actions. My most recent work analyzed 6 lessons from 4 different teachers who underwent professional development aimed at providing opportunities for teachers to plan and enact lessons aligned with evidence-based teaching practices. Each teacher submitted data for 1 or 2 lessons that they deemed exemplary. In this data, which included an out-of-class video, an in-class lesson, in-class student work, and in-class whole class discussions, we observed 2 types of flipped classroom lessons. The first we called summary and application lessons. In these lessons, before class, students watched a video that explained mathematical concepts and procedures, and then during class, they collaboratively summarized key points from the video, and then either used the ideas in the video to solve applied problems, or used ideas in the video to work on a project that required solving more complex problems. The second type of flipped classroom we observed, we called launch and explore lessons. In these, teachers created videos that first scaffolded students toward productive struggle by reminding them of relevant key concepts that the class had recently discussed, and then second, the video launched a high-level task for students to consider, and third, the video elicited student work before the next class session using technology. In this way, the videos launched the subsequent in-class explorations and discussions where the teacher built on student thinking. Based on this work, colleagues here at MTSU and I envision a continuum of possible enactments of flipped classrooms with regard to how that instruction builds on student thinking. At the lowest level, we envision what we call show and tell lessons, where the teacher assigns a pre-class video that explains mathematical concepts and techniques, and then during class, students complete typical homework assignments or work on mastery learning systems. The middle 2 parts of the continuum are summary and application lessons and the launch and explore lessons that I just described. And then at the highest level, we envision sharing student thinking lessons, where students may watch a video that shows some students solving a high-level reasoning task in a small group. And on the video, a teacher could facilitate meaningful discourse, supporting student productive struggle and posing purposeful questions that moves those students' thinking forward and elicits additional thinking. And then during class, a teacher could leverage the video by having their own students in the class compare and contrast their ways of reasoning with the student reasoning that's depicted on the video, and then asking the class to complete additional tasks to achieve the next mathematical goals along the class's learning trajectory. So for research in flipped classrooms, I think it's problematic for flipped classroom research studies to have broad, undescribed variation in what students actually do outside of class and inside of class. Constructing a common language that researchers can use to articulate the types of flipped instruction in mathematics classrooms will help teachers and researchers better understand the affordances and constraints that different kinds of flipped classrooms can offer for supporting effective teaching practices and student learning.
Thanks, Jeremy. This is Darryl Yong, and many thanks to Sam for arranging this great time. Flipped instruction is no longer new, but there's still quite a bit of variance on its effectiveness. I think there are two main reasons for that. One, the instructional practices used in both flipped treatment and non-flipped control settings vary in substantial ways, as Jessica, Wenmin, and Jeremy have pointed out. And two, the instructional content or assessment mechanisms are often not equivalent between treatment and control groups. Many of these studies involve treatment and control groups in different semesters, and it's very natural to use class time that's been freed up by flipping for additional practice or examples. And it seems pretty natural to me that if an instructor finds more opportunities for practice and examples, students are going to learn more. And simultaneously, we have so much evidence that active engagement with content in undergraduate STEM classes leads to better student learning that at this point, we should be concerned about the continued use of traditional lecture as the control in educational studies. So from 2012 to 2016, my colleagues Nancy Lape, Rachel Levy, Rob Townsend, Jacqueline Dresch, Carl Haushalter, and I conducted a 4-year quasi-experimental study of the effects of flipped instruction on student learning gains and attitudes in an undergraduate thermodynamics course in engineering and an introductory differential equations course at Harvey Mudd. The experimental conditions were carefully controlled so that content assessments, assignments, and instructors were identical across both treatment and control groups. Treatment and control sections of the same class ran concurrently in the same semester. And in non-flipped control sections, we were still using active learning pedagogies so that students were talking to each other, asking questions, and doing in-class work. Because we did not allow ourselves to pose tasks to the treatment groups that we did not also pose to the control groups, we could only use classroom time in a flipped condition for more student group work time on in-class and homework problem-solving tasks, while instructors filtered throughout the classroom answering questions. In total, about 600 students participated in the study, and we hypothesized that this additional in-person group work time might allow us to help students uncover any misconceptions in their thinking sooner or forge stronger peer networks. But after 4 years, we did not find any significant differences in student outcomes, either learning gains measured via pre and post content area assessments or attitudes about learning or metacognitive skills. Any differences between treatment and control groups were sporadic and inconsistent between years. So in light of these and other similar results, we and others believe that the primary affordance of flipped instruction might be more opportunities for students to actively engage with content in class. And at Mudd, the lack of significant differences between treatment and control groups is probably due to a saturation effect for active learning pedagogies. In my opinion, asking whether flipped instruction leads to better student learning is like asking whether telecommuting leads to better health outcomes. Many of us right now are teaching remotely and not having to commute to work, but I'm not using that extra time each day to exercise. In fact, I'm mostly sitting in front of a computer all day, and I'm not experiencing better health outcomes by telecommuting. So it's not the elimination of the commute time that's the key, it's what replaces the commuting. So when we talk about flipped instruction research, we need to be really clear whether we're talking about merely replacing the mechanism for delivery of content knowledge, or whether we're also including all of the instructional strategies and additional content that instructors are able to use as a result of the in-person classroom time that's freed up by flipping. And I suspect that flipped instruction leads to better learning outcomes in so much as instructors use that in-class person time for active learning engagement.
Yeah, so really interesting set of studies, all very, very different. And I think that's a strength of the symposium. It certainly gave me a lot of food for thought, in part because of it was such a nice variation of context. So one of the things I was hearing through this was if the bottom line of good instruction is active engagement, framing any kind of instruction and certainly flipped instruction, is how does flipped instruction lead to more of this? That was one question. Another one would be, and this came up, of course, a little bit in what you were discussing, but also what's it being compared to? So in the first set of studies, it was a higher ed study. And I think as Darryl just pointed out, probably the control groups for a number of these studies were college classrooms. And so the comparison is, a lecture that you could be sleeping or not sleeping, and it has the same effect on your learning. And so flipped instruction then replaces a fairly useless lecture with more in-class work time together. So ideally, that would lead to, of course, more interested students and more learning. And I think that's a pretty good assumption to think that that's a reason why some of the results you saw in the first study. In the second study, I think it speaks a little bit as well to Jeremy's, which is that there's multiple kinds of flipped instruction. And I'm kind of curious, as you're sort of working through the variations there, is what are the best ways to employ a pre-recorded video, which is what most flipped instruction is, asynchronously to prepare students for productive synchronous work. And I think that's kind of where Jeremy's, the last model, or the launch and explore model, was kind of heading for. And it's sort of what we're also, when we've tried to go online here, is you're using the asynchronous work to get students to think about a common topic, to interact a little bit with each other actually asynchronously. But then when the synchronous happens, you have all these things to talk about. You're prepared to talk about it. You've done some independent thinking. So the bottom line of that is sort of what is the best use of these pre-recorded videos asynchronously to provoke productive synchronous instruction. So I think that's, and so the other thing I would, I think is important to include here is differences across education levels. So you have elementary, middle, and even high school, which is usually they are seeing the kids every day, which is a very different environment oftentimes than a college class where you might not see them every day. So, and then of course there's content issues and maturity issues and so forth. But so in general, how is flipped instruction or good practice related to flipped instruction change across different educational levels? And with that, I think I will stop.
So I think, especially now with so many more people teaching online, I had heard someone thinking about how they were going to plan for moving to online instruction because of the COVID thing. And they said they were going to do the flipped classroom model for their online instruction. And I thought, usually it's out of class and in class type of framing whenever we talk about the design of flipped instruction. And it's kind of assumed that you're meeting face to face. But really, it's more about the asynchronous versus the synchronous component. So it's all online and all through the computer, but still experiencing the flipped classroom. So I think as someone, a few people mentioned in the session, we're really trying to think carefully about how we can use communication technologies creatively to enact good teaching practices. What we know from research is good teaching practices to support learning. So that's just something that really struck me from Jeff's response, that we're really talking about leveraging asynchronous and synchronous components no matter what environment we find ourselves in.
So then I'm curious if people think that if the time duration does matter, because Jeff is, I hadn't really thought as much about what Jeff was bringing up about the frequency of the synchronous part. So like if the synchronous part is every day, what do you do asynchronously kind of through the flipping? And then what do you do daily when you get back together? But then is that different? Like, do we bring a different strategy to it if it's a weekly kind of thing? You do asynchronous flip stuff and then you come together synchronously on a weekly basis. Do people think about it differently? Or do people still think about it as, well, no, the instruction that I'm thinking about is still the same instruction, and it doesn't matter if it's daily or if it's weekly. I'm still trying to promote these certain kinds of opportunities or interactions. I'm curious about what people think about that.
This is Zandra. I can jump in. I think that what you're saying is true, that everybody's kind of alluded to this, is that we have synchronous and asynchronous sections of our class, or sessions, portions, whatever you want to say, of our courses. And so thinking about how we're using that now, I will say that as a society, pretty much when educational innovations, I'll use that term loosely, come up, we're recreating what we've known, because it's hard to make something that you've never seen before in these new formats. So whether we have more or less synchronous time or asynchronous time, we're really translating what we've been doing and what we've been trained to do in teacher prep and other wares and PD and whatnot into these new formats. And so I think we're seeing not a huge amount of variation among the various different ways you can flip. It's like recreating different aspects in different proportions, but it's not anything really new, at least in our study. And so as we move into the COVID situation that we're in now, I think we're still seeing that, right? We're seeing like a lot of asynchronous in our districts, but they're really trying to recreate what the patterns of instruction were in their classes prior to that, just in an asynchronous remote format. And I'm not sure that's the best approach.
Zandra, I think that's a really interesting point, that people generally tend to do what they're already accustomed to doing. Related point to that would be that, if we look at all of these educational studies about flipped classroom instruction, most of them are done by people who are really thoughtful about instruction. So you might imagine maybe some sort of bias for people to be using really good instructional practices in their flipped classrooms, as opposed to, maybe when we see broader acceptance and broader use of flipped classroom instruction, we might not see quite those same things in the wild.
Yeah, this is something that is interesting to me as more and more people flip their classrooms, and even we've got districts that administrations are encouraging all teachers to do it, whether it was their idea to do it or not. Like, the reason the first folks who came up with the flipped idea was that they were university professors who wanted to have more time for active engagement in their own classes. So they were thinking about, how can I incorporate some of the reform-oriented recommendations to change my instruction and make it better, versus trying to replicate what I'm already doing in another format. So I think the history of the flipped classroom can, if we leverage it right, there's the potential for folks to say, oh, this is a mechanism for me to think about improving instruction, rather than just continuing the same thing that I've been doing.
It's an interesting point that you bring up, because like they wanted to free up class time to do more active engagement. And instead of saying, let's lose the lecture and see what that would look like, there's like this professional obligation to the lecture. So instead of like saying, yeah, we could reformat it and like rethink it in a different way, let's shove that lecture to a video. And then I still feel like I'm, meeting that commitment, but then I can do the active learning in the in-class portion. So another way we could have approached this, and what some people have done, is say, I'm going to get rid of the lecture and see how a classroom genuinely built around active engagement and inquiry might look. And I think it's interesting as technologies kind of evolve alongside this, is that a lot of tech companies look at what teachers are doing, and then they're making tools to more easily facilitate that type of learning. So if you think about like Flipgrid and things like that, where you can post videos, that's like aligned to some formats of instruction that we already have going. And so we really need people to think outside the box and push ideas out that might like really transform some of the things we're doing in productive ways as we move to more remote teaching.
Ruby and JP, I'm curious about if you see, having looked at a lot of different studies of flipped instruction, if you see what Zandra's talking about in terms of the flipping, but still keeping a lot of the main elements of teaching, or do you see in those studies that they're really trying to do something completely different? Is it completely different, or is it just sort of reorganizing the stuff that you were already doing?
The majority of them that I've seen so far is just reorganizing what they're already doing so that they can have more class time to work on tasks with their students.
But then in making that reorganization, hoping that it unlocks something that's going to lead to some greater achievement or something like that. So maybe putting a little bit too much hope on a sort of slight reorganization.
Right. A lot of them were looking at like multiple components, not just student achievement, but they wanted attendance to increase. They wanted student motivation to increase. They wanted to see if it would impact the student's self-efficacy within, that classroom and their mathematics ability.
So have you seen different, I guess this is like slanted towards equity concerns or just perceptions about students. Have you seen, working with teachers in the various studies, that they have perceptions that some students are capable of, achieving in flipped environments, and then others it's probably not best suited? And does it follow along any particular student demographic lines?
Well, actually, it was one of the things that I was thinking about, is that when you have different, connectivity at home, or different resources, or different even spaces to productively listen to a video without distractions, I would think that would create some equity issues and really advantage the students who are already advantaged and disadvantage those who already have difficulty, getting stuff done at home.
Yeah, totally. I see that with like this whole remote learning thing that we as a nation are undergoing currently. I was asking the question because some of the teachers in our study have explicitly said, I will flip with my honors class, but I won't with my regular algebra class because I think the honor students can handle it and the other students can't, or, things like that. So I didn't know, Jeremy or Darryl, if you have encountered anything like that in terms of like majors or like programs that people think students are more capable of flipped than others.
Yeah, for me, just anecdotally, I think it was it Ruby and JP that mentioned the statistics classes were the most commonly flipped classes. So in terms of types of classes, it seems that introductory classes often get flipped. But again, this is just anecdotally. I haven't looked systematically at types.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really stood out. Like the majority of the post-secondary courses were statistics, either pure mathematical statistics courses or a business statistics course.
Zandra, I think you're raising a really interesting question. So I'm going to approach it from two different ways. I think from one perspective, at Harvey Mudd, we're a pretty small liberal arts, mostly residential campus. So I think there's not so many issues about access to technology as much. We're not seeing any differences with respect to gender and race and ethnicity, more so with perhaps prior achievement levels in previous classes. I think the key issue here is that many instructors are replacing their traditional lecture, at least at undergraduate level, their lecturers with more active engagements in the classroom. And then this is a area where we have to now understand and examine how teachers and professors are thinking about students' abilities to engage in what are often higher order kinds of thinking modes, problem-solving skills, evaluating, critiquing, applying. Those things are often more challenging than simply regurgitating information. And when I'm interacting with a student in the classroom, do I have a different expectation for example, students of color than I do for white students? That would lead to a very different kind of outcome in my classroom.
I was just curious where your studies are going next, because in terms of our project team, the next thing we're kind of looking at or hoping to look at pending funding is how do we capitalize on some of the aspects of instruction that we see correlated with student learning outcomes. So we know that there's a lot of complication in terms of we know students when they watch the videos or report watching the videos, their learning outcomes are positively correlated, right? So the more they watch, the more or the higher their student learning outcomes. But we want to see, can we nudge some of those behaviors, I guess, for lack of a better word. So can we get students to engage more as they watch or to watch more, because a lot of students don't report watching the videos or watch them without the sound on, for example. Can we see different outcomes based on supporting teachers and getting students to do those behaviors that we see are correlated? So that's kind of where we're thinking we'll take our study. And I was just curious where you all are both going next with your study.
Well, I'm interested in exploring more what different types of flipped classrooms there could be. So for example, Zandra, you had mentioned moving away from the lecture and practice kind of cycle, using the videos for something other than lecture. So I guess this is kind of a question back to everybody and an area that I'm interested in exploring. Okay, so we could try to use the video to do the launch and explore type of teaching practice that we know supports student learning, but are there other new ways that we could use video to open up different types of learning experiences for students? So one was that the sharing student thinking type of a lesson. Now, this is something that we will often explore in our courses for teachers, showing videos of students sharing their own thinking, and then we ask, well, what would you do next as a teacher to move that student's thinking forward? But with video technology, we could show students exploring a mathematics problem, kind of struggling through it, and not necessarily coming to a solution on their own, and then would that be a productive video to show as students are learning new mathematics content? It's almost like giving them a virtual partner to struggle through a problem with. Like, is that a creative and productive way to use communication technology to help students learn or not? So that's kind of a question for me. I'm envisioning the types of videos that are on the mathtalk.org, Joanne Labato's project. Like, is there a way that those types of videos could be used just to learn mathematics together?
I hope so. That's so awesome that you're thinking about that too, because that was one of the things that Sam and I got so excited about doing the study is like, we're like, this could be so great. You could do so many cool things. And then like, as we got into it, it's like, oh, we're seeing a lot of the same thing over and over, like lecture videos in a traditional format. So I would love if people use videos like those. That'd be so cool.
Yeah. So a question for me is like, how can we position teachers because that takes a lot of production in order to create videos like that. So like, how do we move teachers into spaces like that? That's a new kind of professional development challenge.
Yeah, at the moment, we're not moving forward more with our flipped classroom instruction research, but we are looking a lot more at the ways that students experience group work in the classroom in undergraduate settings.
And Wenmin and Jessica, do you want to just share a little bit about what you're still thinking about related to the instructional profiles?
Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about when we highlighted our type 1 and type 2 profiles is that we've actually seen some other unique cases. There's one that we were thinking about as we were preparing for this that has a very unique way of using their videos in terms of everything is on video. The students are on different levels. They are very asynchronous. And when you all were talking about using synchronous and asynchronous videos before, I was kind of wondering, now that we have everybody on their computers, I wonder if that impacted their instruction at all, if it changed anything, or if they're just keeping on with business as usual, their business as usual. So those are some ideas that we're still thinking about and would like to have the opportunity to maybe explore further. Wenmin, did you have anything?
Yeah, so when we talked about that kind of instruction with the teachers we observed, they actually talk about like other teachers from maybe the nearby school district will go to visit their classrooms. So we think about like if teachers, they can feel the advantages of doing flipped, and then if they started to promote it, maybe more and more teachers like will join to make flip instruction or make it much better. It is like from the bottom to the up. If they started to realize the benefits of doing that, and then if more teachers engage in like flip instruction, we might have a better chance to like improve the flip instruction.
Well, thanks everybody for sharing your work and sharing your ideas. I'm glad that we got to get together and at least have a little bit of conversation about this topic. It's one that's probably becoming even more relevant than ever. But I am sorry that we didn't get to see each other in San Francisco, so hopefully we can still cross paths at whenever conferences start back up. So everyone, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for speaking with us.